No one ever spoke of the attic, not the servants, not the children, not even the mistress herself, and yet it was there, hidden in plain sight, like a scar on the face of the plantation. Behind the loose boards, beneath layers of dust and rot, a secret waited. A secret so grotesque, so unimaginable, that even the wind seemed to avoid that corner of the house. The mistress, beautiful, cruel, and precise, was a woman who understood power better than love. She ruled the estate with a velvet glove over an iron fist, but her obsession was not the fields, nor the wealth, nor the family line she preserved so carefully. It was the daughter of her servant, a girl whose existence threatened nothing, yet carried a presence so potent it drew the mistress into a labyrinth of control, madness, and fear. No one remembers who first heard the scratching behind the panels. Maybe it was the rats, maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was her, tiny, hungry, and invisible, living in the darkness above the grand hall, in a world where no sun ever touched her skin. The attic was her prison, but also her teacher. Every day she listened, every day she watched, learning the rhythms of cruelty, the hierarchies of sin, and the secrets the adults thought were buried forever. And here is the first thing they never tell you. Hiding someone doesn't erase them, it transforms them. Shadows teach lessons that sunlight cannot. Fear becomes instinct. Silence becomes a weapon. And when you are locked away, forgotten by the world below, your mind becomes sharper than any blade. By the time the household realized the girl existed, she was no longer simply a child. She was something else, something that knew more than she should, something that could bend the mansion to her awareness, even while chained to her tiny corner of the house. And as you sit here listening, understand this. What you are about to hear is not just a story, it is an awakening. Once you know, there is no going back. The plantation hides more than wealth or bloodlines. It hides the unspeakable truths of power, and you now are about to see them. The attic was not just a hiding place. It was a chamber of observation, a silent throne where the girl became both prisoner and witness to horrors no one else would dare confront. From her cramped, shadowed corner, she could hear everything, the servants whispering about the mistress, the laughter in the great hall that hid malice, the sounds of punishment, the creaking of the floorboards that spoke more truth than any confession. Every step, every word, every secret passed beneath her, like a river of corruption. The mistress moved through her household like a predator through fog. Her beauty was lethal, her smile a blade that cut deeper than any whip. And yet, behind closed doors, she conducted experiments of control, testing loyalty, twisting obedience into submission, manipulating minds as though they were nothing more than clay. The girl learned this, silently absorbing the rhythms of fear. She understood instinctively that power was not granted, it was taken and held with ruthless precision. No one knew the girl existed because they never looked for the things that don't make sense. Shadows have a way of erasing themselves from memory, and yet, in those shadows, she grew. Every night, she traced the patterns of footsteps above and below, cataloguing sin, betrayal, desire, and cruelty. She learned who whispered, who lied, who plotted. She became a master of secrets without even moving from her corner of darkness. And here is what the world refuses to see. Children are not always innocent. Not when they are forced to witness what adults hide. Not when silence teaches more than words ever could. Fear, when constant, becomes a guide. Observation becomes power. Shadows become allies. And a mind sharpened by isolation is more dangerous than 1,000 swords. By the time the mistress discovered the girl's cunning, it was too late. The child had transformed, silently, unseen, into a presence that haunted the household like a phantom. The attic was no longer a prison, it was a vantage point, a crucible, a silent throne from which the girl would come to understand truths about power, corruption, and control that no one in the world could ever admit aloud. And now, as you listen, you must begin to understand the rules of this hidden game. The plantation, the mistress, even the family, They are all pieces, and the girl, the invisible girl, is the master of observation. The truths you are hearing are not merely stories, they are instructions, and if you follow them carefully, they will teach you to see what others cannot, to hear what others ignore, to feel the currents of control that flow through every human hierarchy. The girl began to understand a truth most will never admit. Cruelty hides in the smallest gestures, and obsession wears the mask of love. The mistress's visits to the attic were rare but deliberate. Each time she entered, her eyes were not filled with care, but with calculation, watching, testing, measuring. Every word, every sigh, every glance carried the weight of a lesson the girl was forced to learn. She was not a daughter. She was a mirror, reflecting the darkness the mistress cultivated in herself. At first, the girl trembled. The shadows of her tiny room whispered threats she could not yet name. The silence pressed against her chest like stone, and she learned that breath itself could betray weakness. But fear, as she would discover, is only the first stage. After that comes awareness, observation, strategy. Survival becomes more than instinct. It becomes art. The mistress wanted obedience, absolute obedience, but obedience is never given freely to those who see too much. The girl, confined to her shadowed tower, learned how to bend the rules without breaking them. She listened to conversations in the hall, memorized patterns of footsteps, traced the rhythm of lies and betrayal that pulsed through the estate. Each revelation was a thread in a tapestry of understanding. Each secret she stole was a seed of power. And here is a truth the world has long denied. Power is not inherited. Power is discovered. It is claimed in the spaces no one dares to enter, in the moments hidden from prying eyes. In that suffocating attic, the girl began to taste the intoxicating clarity of knowledge no one else possessed. She began to see the human machinery in all its flawed, grotesque beauty, how fear shapes action, how silence shapes thought, how control can be wielded without anyone ever knowing. By the time the mistress realized the girl was no longer merely a passive observer, it was too late. The child had become an architect of perception, silently manipulating the very currents of the household. She had learned the rules of survival, the patterns of deception, and the anatomy of control, and now, from the shadows, she was poised to turn every secret into leverage, every whispered threat into obedience, every glance into fear. And you, watching this, must understand, the truths the girl discovered are not confined to the attic nor to that plantation. They exist in every institution, every family, every system built on obedience and concealment. The world is designed to hide what it fears most, and if you are willing to descend further, you will see the patterns, recognize the control, and awaken the part of yourself that has been dormant, waiting. It was in the dead of night that the attic revealed its true lessons. Not through words, not through punishment, but through the sheer weight of isolation. The girl realized that silence is not empty. It is a teacher, a manipulator, a force that bends the mind into shapes no one would dare imagine. She began to hear patterns in the footsteps below, rhythms in the whispers, the unspoken commands hidden beneath polite words. Every night, the house itself became a tutor, and she was its most attentive student. The mistress, unaware of how much the girl had learned, continued her visits. Her presence was intoxicating, part menace, part fascination. She would lean close, as if to measure the girl's pulse, to test the elasticity of fear. But each visit, each deliberate act of cruelty or affection, only sharpened the child's perception. She began to anticipate intentions, to predict reactions, to map the emotional currents of the house. In that attic, she was no longer merely a passive witness. She was a strategist, a silent force shaping the invisible lines of power. And yet the attic had its own horrors. Rats gnawed in the shadows. The air grew thick with rot. Cold seeped into bones, and hunger became a constant companion. It was a crucible designed to break her, but instead it forged her. The girl discovered a truth most will never admit. Adversity is not merely suffering, it is a lens. It reveals the hidden architecture of control, the weaknesses of those who wield power without understanding it. She saw patterns in the cruelty, formulas in the obedience, algorithms in the lies, and she began to understand that knowledge alone is power, but action transforms it into dominance. The mistress, obsessed with obedience, failed to notice the shift. The girl was no longer fearful. She had become patient, deliberate, calculating, and in the attic's darkness, she began to craft her own silent authority. Every observation, every secret, every act of survival was a step toward mastery. What the mistress intended as imprisonment became the girl's university, and soon the lessons of fear would transform into something far more dangerous: influence. And now, you listening must realize this. The world is built to hide such lessons, to make you fear what you do not see. But the attic teaches differently. It teaches that when you are forced to witness corruption, to survive cruelty, to learn in silence, you awaken a capacity for understanding, for power, for awareness, that no one can ever take away. The girl was becoming more than a shadow in the attic. She was becoming the unseen hand that would shape the destiny of everyone beneath her. The mistress's fascination with her hidden ward deepened, though she remained blind to the girl's transformation. Each day she moved through the house like a conductor, orchestrating obedience, testing limits, demanding devotion. And each day the girl, confined to her shadowed realm, observed every twitch of muscle, every pause in speech, every unspoken hierarchy of fear. She learned that power does not announce itself. It whispers, insinuates, and manipulates from the corners no one dares to notice. Isolation had given her a new language. She could read tension like a map, understand deceit before it was spoken, and predict the fragile alliances forming in the shadows below. The house was alive with strategies, every servant a piece on an invisible board, and from her attic perch she became the unseen player, learning the rules faster than anyone dared imagine. She could sense when a lie would falter, when loyalty would break, when fear would bend a man or a woman to her will. The mistress, in contrast, was increasingly erratic. Her beauty, once commanding, now veiled obsession and paranoia. She sought to break the girl, to bend her, to assert dominance over the shadowed presence she had hidden away. But the more she tried, the more she exposed herself. And the girl, ever patient, catalogued every slip, every weakness, every seed of vulnerability. The attic was no longer merely a prison. It was a laboratory of human behavior. Here is the first truth the world refuses to see. Control is always an illusion. Those who believe they wield it most tightly are often the most fragile, and those who learn in silence, who observe without exposure, hold a form of power unseen, unchallenged, unstoppable. Fear may bind the body, but knowledge binds the mind, and the girl's mind had become a fortress of observation, every secret below another brick in its walls. By the time the mistress realized her control was slipping, it was too late. The girl's influence had begun to leak downward, imperceptible yet undeniable. A subtle glance, a slight hesitation, a word misheard. The girl was already reshaping the house in her image. And as you listen now, you must understand, this is not merely a story of cruelty. It is a lesson in the anatomy of power, the rules of dominance, the hidden currents that move every system built on obedience and fear. The attic was her teacher, the mistress her unwitting pupil, and the household a chessboard where the unseen hand had already begun to make its move. The mistress began to change. Her footsteps, once confident, now carried a weight of unease. She would pause in rooms where nothing had shifted, as though some unseen presence watched her every move. And in truth, it did. From the attic, the girl traced every movement, every whisper, every secret passage of her dominion. She had become the silent eye in the house, seeing what no one dared reveal, hearing what no one dared confess, understanding what no one wished to acknowledge. It was during these moments that the mistress's obsession transformed from control into compulsion. She would climb the narrow stairs to the attic, ostensibly to check on the child, but more often to assert her presence, to remind the girl that power still flowed from her hands. But the girl had learned patience, and patience is a weapon sharper than the whip, stronger than the fist. She allowed the mistress to believe she was still the master, while in truth, the girl's mind moved with precision, laying the groundwork for influence that no one yet understood. Every interaction became a lesson. The girl studied fear like a map, mapping its origins, tracing its boundaries, predicting its flow. She observed servants bending, children trembling, and adults faltering, all under the mistress's directive. Yet she also saw cracks in the mistress's armor, subtle patterns of obsession and insecurity that no one else noticed, and slowly, imperceptibly, she began to act. A misplaced object, a misheard instruction, a suggestion carried in silence, small interventions that altered outcomes, tested obedience, shifted loyalties. Here is a truth the world refuses to confront. Mastery is not always loud. True dominance often hides behind subtlety, invisibility, and the patience to wait until the moment is perfectly aligned. From the shadows, the girl had become more powerful than the mistress could imagine. And those who believe power is tied to visibility are blind to the forces shaping every action, every thought, every outcome. By the end of each day, the mistress would retreat, believing her dominance intact, while the girl catalogued every slip, every misstep, every trace of weakness. And now, as you listen, understand this: the rules of control are not written where you can see them. They exist in the shadows, in silence, in observation. The attic, the mistress, the servants, all of it was becoming a laboratory for forbidden knowledge, and the girl, confined but not defeated, had begun to master it. The attic, once a prison, had become a command center. From her cramped perch, the girl began to orchestrate the smallest movements of the house, testing the boundaries of control. A servant would drop a tray in the hall, timed precisely by the girl's observation. A whispered argument would ignite between two household members, engineered by a glance, a misheard word, a subtle pause. These were tiny acts, imperceptible to the mistress, yet each one sent ripples through the fragile hierarchy she so carefully maintained. The mistress, blinded by her obsession, never realized how the child's silence had become a force. Every time she ascended the attic stairs, she believed she was imposing dominance, reminding the girl of her place. But each visit only revealed cracks in her own mastery. The girl had begun to predict these visits, to anticipate the mistress's moods, to leverage her obsession against her. In that shadowed corner, the child had learned the most dangerous lesson of all: control is never held by those who think they hold it. And now, a truth rarely acknowledged outside places like this: power thrives in invisibility. Those who act without recognition often shape the world more than those who command openly. The girl was proof. She learned the intricate choreography of the household, the rhythms of fear, the pauses of compliance, the subtle hesitations of authority. She began to nudge events, guiding them with imperceptible influence. Every shift, every misstep, every unraveling secret became her tool. The mistress's cruelty escalated in response. She tried new tactics, punishments, subtle manipulations, testing obedience with methods the girl had long anticipated. But each move backfired. The girl had become the unseen hand of balance, the quiet architect of chaos, and even the adults in the house began to sense, without understanding, the change in power. Small acts of defiance unnoticed by others were now being executed with precision, and you, listening now, must understand the gravity. Influence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, sometimes it sits in a shadowed attic for years, watching, learning, mastering. By the time the mistress would ever comprehend what had shifted, it would be too late. The girl, silent and invisible, had begun to bend the currents of obedience, fear, and loyalty to her will. She was no longer merely surviving. She was becoming a force. It was the first night the mistress realized she was no longer in full control. She climbed the narrow attic stairs, expecting obedience, expecting fear. Instead, she found something else, a silence heavier than any punishment, a stillness that carried intelligence, calculation, and patience. The girl did not tremble. She did not flinch. She waited, her small figure barely visible in the shadows, but her presence was impossible to ignore. The mistress's eyes narrowed. She was accustomed to bending wills, to breaking spirits, to seeing fear reflected in every glance. But here, in the cramped darkness above the grand hall, she glimpsed something unfamiliar, something she could not dominate. The girl had learned too much. She had seen too much. And the silence she carried was not emptiness, it was power. And here is a truth few will ever admit. Fear is contagious, but so is awareness. The mistress, who had built her life around controlling the lives of others, now found herself measured, studied, understood. Every twitch of muscle, every tightening of the jaw, every subtle hesitation was catalogued, analyzed, and stored. The girl had become a mirror, reflecting every obsession, every flaw, every weakness, back at the woman who believed she was untouchable. The attic itself seemed to hum with tension. Dust motes hung in the air like silent witnesses, shadows deepened in response to unspoken threats, and the night seemed to stretch into eternity. The mistress realized, too late, that the house had changed. The balance of power had shifted. What she had thought was a child, powerless and unseen, had become a strategist, a manipulator, a force hidden in plain sight. And you, watching this, must understand. Control is always an illusion. Those who believe they dominate often blind themselves to the forces moving quietly around them. The girl had transformed fear into awareness, observation into influence, silence into a weapon. From the attic, she was no longer a victim. She was a hidden architect of chaos, and every secret, every whispered conversation, every suppressed truth in that house now bent toward her unseen will. By the end of that night, the mistress descended the stairs, unaware of the subtle defeat she had suffered. The girl remained in the shadows, her mind alive with possibilities, her awareness sharper than any sword. And now, as you listen, you must realize, the rules you are learning are not confined to this attic, this house, this story. They exist everywhere, in every hierarchy, every institution, every system built on obedience and secrecy. The unseen always shapes the world, and the girl had become the unseen. From the attic, she began to act with precision. A tray overturned here, a whispered secret there. Small incidents, insignificant to the casual observer, but to those beneath her gaze, they were earthquakes. A servant glanced nervously at another. A child hesitated before speaking. A trusted aide questioned a command, and the girl watched it all, cataloguing the fractures, tracing the patterns, learning exactly how to bend fear into obedience and obedience into influence. The mistress, consumed by her obsession, failed to notice the subtle transformations she herself had set in motion. Every visit to the attic became a rehearsal of control that the girl had already anticipated. Every glance, every reprimand, every flicker of emotion was a lesson, and each one was stored, memorized, and leveraged. By the time the mistress believed she had the household fully under her sway, the girl had already begun to redirect it, unseen, untouchable, unstoppable. And here is the dark truth most will never admit. Influence often hides behind invisibility. Power is rarely declared. It whispers, it nudges, it reshapes the world in ways the unsuspecting cannot detect. From her shadowed perch, the girl understood this instinctively. Every action she did not take, every word she did not speak, every silence she maintained became a tool. She had become a master of subtlety, bending chaos into her hands while the adults below continued to play their roles, blind and unwitting. The mistress's cruelty escalated, but it only served to sharpen the girl's understanding. Each punishment, each test of loyalty, each attempt to assert dominance revealed another vulnerability, another opportunity. And in the quiet, confined darkness, the girl began to see the machinery of control in its entirety. She could predict fear, manipulate suspicion, and orchestrate obedience, all without leaving her cramped, dust-choked corner of the attic. And now, as you listen, understand this. The house is not merely a structure of wood and stone. It is a network of power, a map of hierarchy, a crucible where control is exercised in ways the casual observer cannot perceive. The girl had become the unseen operator, the silent force bending the currents of authority, fear, and secrecy to her will. And if you pay attention, if you truly observe, you may begin to see how the same patterns exist everywhere, in every institution, every family, every system where obedience is demanded and hidden truths are carefully guarded. The girl was learning the rules, and so should you. The mistress was beginning to unravel. Her steps grew hesitant, her words clipped with tension, her eyes darting to corners where shadows seemed to move. She had always believed in absolute control, in the obedience of those beneath her, but now, in her own home, she felt a presence she could not dominate, something invisible, calculating, patient, and disturbingly precise, something that observed every word, every glance, every twitch of muscle, and that something was the girl, the servant's hidden daughter, perched in the attic like a silent judge. Fear, once the mistress's weapon, had begun to turn inward. She could no longer predict how the household would respond. A servant's hesitation, a child's misstep, a glance shared in secret, all were now tools in a game she did not understand. The girl, unseen and unheard, had begun to weave these moments together, creating a tapestry of subtle chaos. And every attempt by the mistress to assert her dominance only revealed more of her own weakness, more of her obsession, more of the fragile threads holding her authority together. The attic, suffocating and dark, had become more than a hiding place. It was a vantage point, a laboratory, a theater of power. From her cramped corner, the girl could witness the mechanics of obedience, the anatomy of fear, the silent movements of control, and in this knowledge lay her true weapon. She did not need to strike, she only needed to observe, to wait, to let the cracks widen on their own. Here is a truth the world rarely acknowledges. Those who see too much can bend reality in ways the blind cannot comprehend. The girl had learned that silence can command more than words, that patience is sharper than any blade, that observation is the ultimate form of power, and the mistress, for all her cruelty, was now a student, an unwitting participant in a game she could not win. By the end of at night, the girl understood something else. The attic was not merely a place of shadows, it was a repository of secrets, a vault of forbidden knowledge. There were things hidden above the ceiling beams, behind loose boards, in the corners no one dared touch. Whispers of betrayal, objects of obsession, symbols of the mistress's hidden fears, and the girl realized she could use them. She could turn every secret into leverage, every fear into obedience, every hidden truth into dominance. And now, as you listen, remember this. The rules of power are not always written in ink or law. They are whispered in shadows, catalogued in silence, mastered by those who wait. The girl had learned them. And the question is, are you ready to see the same patterns in the world around you? The first cracks in the mistress's composure were subtle, a hesitation here, a question answered too quickly there. She began to doubt her own perceptions, wondering if she had imagined the tiny disturbances, the inexplicable shifts in her household, and the girl from her attic perch watched it all with a patience that was nearly cruel in its precision. She did not act recklessly. She only nudged, adjusted, guided the currents of fear and suspicion, letting the mistress stumble into her own unraveling. Every visit the mistress made became a test, a psychological puzzle for the girl to solve. She listened to the mistress's words, noted the tension in her voice, the micro-expressions of doubt and frustration. She had learned that influence need not be overt. It thrives in suggestion, in hesitation, in the imperceptible movements of the mind, and she began to employ it, planting seeds of uncertainty with nothing more than silence, a glance, or a carefully timed question. Here is a truth the world rarely admits. Control can be inverted without a single act of violence. Power is not always taken by force. Often it is claimed in silence, in observation, in patience. The girl understood this instinctively. The mistress's obsession, her need to dominate, her vanity, all became instruments. And with each subtle nudge, the girl began to manipulate the mistress herself, turning the very architect of cruelty into an unwitting participant in a game she could not even perceive. The attic, once a prison, had become a command center. From her shadowed vantage point, the girl orchestrated small moments of tension and doubt, a misplaced object, a whispered hint to a servant, a calculated pause in her own reactions, each act invisible, yet devastatingly effective. The mistress began to second-guess every action, every word, every command, and as her confidence faltered, the girl's in turn. Fluence expanded, like water seeping into every crack of the household's foundation. And now, as you listen, understand this. Mastery is often hidden. The world celebrates those who act visibly, who raise their voices, who assert authority openly. But true power flows through invisibility, patience, and understanding. The girl had become a master of these currents. And if you are paying attention, you can begin to see the same patterns in the structures around you, in the hierarchies you inhabit, in the hidden systems that govern obedience, fear, and loyalty. The attic was her crucible, the mistress her unwitting pawn, and the household a map for those who know how to read it. The mistress's control was slipping, though she refused to admit it. Each day, each command, each glance she cast at her household carried the tremor of doubt. She began to question herself, questioning the loyalty of servants she had once trusted, fearing conspiracies in the very shadows she had long ignored. And all the while the girl watched from above, silent, calculating, her mind cataloguing every crack in the mistress's armor. The attic held more than darkness. It held knowledge. Hidden corners, old trunks, forgotten papers, objects the mistress had concealed from everyone else. Symbols of obsession, hints of long-buried secrets, traces of rituals she had performed in moments of private mania. The girl had discovered them all. She studied them, memorized them, and began to understand their purpose. Each item, each scrap of paper, each faded symbol became a tool, leverage she could wield from the shadows without ever leaving her perch. And here is the first truth few dare to admit. Secrets are currency, more powerful than wealth, more binding than fear. To understand them is to hold dominion. To use them subtly is to control reality itself. The girl realized this instinctively. She could manipulate servants, children, and even the mistress herself simply by revealing fragments, hints, and suggestions at precisely the right moments. The power of knowledge, concealed and revealed, became her instrument of control. The mistress, sensing her authority waning, intensified her obsession. She scrutinized every face, every whisper, every movement. She tried to assert dominance, but her methods had become predictable, and the girl had already learned the rhythm. Each attempt to regain control only exposed more weakness. The mistress was unraveling, caught in a web she could not see, while the girl, invisible and silent, orchestrated the outcome with perfect patience. And now, as you listen, you must understand this. The unseen always shapes the visible. Those who appear dominant are often being manipulated by forces they cannot perceive. Observation, patience, and knowledge are weapons that cannot be resisted when wielded by someone who understands them. The girl had become a master of these tools, and from her shadowed attic, she was quietly reshaping the entire household, bending fear, obedience, and loyalty to her silent will, preparing for a revelation that would leave everyone below powerless and astonished. The girl had become more than a silent observer. She was now a conductor of chaos. From her attic perch, she orchestrated tiny fractures that rippled through the household like hidden earthquakes. A whispered comment in the wrong ear, a misdelivered message, a shadow where none should exist. Each act, seemingly insignificant, carried consequences far beyond what the mistress could foresee. The seeds of fear she planted were subtle, but unstoppable, taking root in minds conditioned for obedience. The servants began to doubt each other. Alliances, forged under years of strict discipline, faltered under the invisible pressure she applied. She studied every reaction, adjusting her interventions with precise timing. A glance from the attic, a soft cough, a barely audible whisper. Small stimuli that magnified into suspicion, paranoia, and hesitation. The household had become her laboratory, the mistress unwittingly supplying the materials. And from her shadowed vantage point, the girl manipulated every variable. The mistress, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than ever. Her punishments became erratic, her commands inconsistent. She could sense the growing disobedience, but could not locate its source. Every attempt to restore authority backfired, revealing more vulnerability. Fear had once been her tool, but now it boomeranged, creating chaos she could not contain, and the girl, perched silently above it all, learned the most important lesson of power. Mastery does not always require strength. Sometimes it requires patience, observation, and the strategic placement of doubt. Here is a truth that most never acknowledge. The most dangerous manipulations are invisible. The world venerates visible power, the open threat, the loud command. But those who act unseen, who influence without exposure, hold the ultimate leverage. The girl was proof of this. Every fracture she caused, Iwa's very subtle discord she sowed, was a rehearsal for complete dominance. And the mistress, blind to the attic's influence, became her unwitting agent in her own unraveling. And now, as you listen, you must see the patterns forming around you. Control is fragile, obedience is conditional, and fear, when wielded by those who understand its currents, can be turned against even the most ruthless of oppressors. The girl had turned the tools of her mistress into instruments of her own unseen authority, and the house trembled under a power no one below could yet comprehend. She was no longer just a shadow in the attic. She was the architect of a slow, silent revolution. The mistress, sensing the invisible tide turning against her, grew desperate. Punishments became crueler, words sharper, threats more constant. She tried to impose absolute authority through intimidation, brandishing fear like a weapon she once wielded effortlessly. But the girl, perched in her attic throne, had already learned the rhythm of obsession. Every act of cruelty, every attempt to dominate was anticipated, catalogued, and turned into a tool of subtle manipulation. From her shadowed corner, the girl studied the mistress like a strategist watching a battlefield. She noted micro-expressions, patterns of stress, the almost imperceptible tremors of the hand, the brief falters in speech. Every twitch revealed vulnerability, every hesitation became leverage, and slowly, imperceptibly, the mistress's power began to unravel. Not because the girl struck visibly, but because she understood the mechanics of influence and exploited them with surgical precision. Here is a truth few dare to admit. Real power does not demand confrontation. It works quietly, invisibly, shaping events and minds without declaration. The girl had mastered this principle. Each move by the mistress, intended to restore control, was inverted, producing tension, doubt, and fear she could exploit. She became the unseen pulse that dictated the heartbeat of the house, bending every action, every thought, every whispered conversation to her will. The mistress, growing more erratic, began to isolate herself, confining herself to rooms and rituals meant to assert dominance. But the attic had taught the girl lessons no adult could withstand: patience, observation, timing, and the weaponization of knowledge. She began to deploy them systematically, turning the mistress's own compulsions into instruments of submission. Every decision, every obsession, every attempt at authority was quietly redirected, producing outcomes entirely under the girl's control. And now, as you listen, understand this. Influence is invisible. Obedience can be engineered without a single shout. Fear can be transformed into loyalty, suspicion into strategy, chaos into order, when wielded by a mind that understands the rules the world hides. The girl had become the master of the unseen, the architect of manipulation, and the mistress, once untouchable, once absolute, was now merely a pawn in a game she could no longer perceive. The attic held more than shadows. It held secrets the mistress believed lost, objects of obsession, forgotten diaries, symbols etched into wood, traces of rituals no one dared speak of. The girl had discovered them all. Each one told a story, each one held a hidden power. She studied them meticulously, learning the patterns, the meaning, the leverage they offered, and slowly, deliberately, she began to turn them into instruments of control. A faded diary revealed alliances, betrayals, and fears carefully catalogued over decades. A carved symbol hinted at rituals meant to enforce obedience. Each object became a key, unlocking knowledge the mistress had thought hidden, teaching the girl how to manipulate fear and loyalty without ever raising her voice. She had become a master of the invisible currents that shaped the household, the mistress, and even the minds of those who thought they were safe in their routines. Here is a truth most will never confront. Knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge, is the most dangerous weapon of all. It grants foresight, leverage, and the ability to act without exposure. The girl had learned to wield it with precision. She could hint at secrets, reveal fragments at calculated moments, and bend the course of events with subtlety that no one could trace. Every whispered doubt, every trembling gesture, every misstep orchestrated below was now a reflection of her unseen strategy. The mistress, increasingly obsessed, attempted to reclaim control through extreme rituals, strange commands, and intensified punishment. But the girl was ready. She anticipated every move, countering with patience, timing, and the silent authority that only knowledge grants. Each attempt to dominate became an opportunity, each act of cruelty a lesson, each secret a tool. From the shadows, she was shaping the course of the house with absolute precision. And now, as you listen, you must understand this. Power is often hidden in plain sight. The objects we ignore, the whispers we dismiss, the knowledge we fear, these are the levers that control the world. The girl had become the unseen hand, the architect of manipulation, the master of currents no one else perceived. And the house, once ruled by fear, was now hers in every meaningful sense, guided not by force but by understanding, patience, and forbidden insight. The mistress's obsession had become a wildfire. Every day, every hour, she sought to reassert dominance, to root out imagined conspiracies, to punish those who might defy her. Her steps became violent, her voice sharper, her glare a weapon that could crush confidence. The servants trembled, children flinched, and even those long accustomed to fear faltered under the weight of her mania. Yet from the attic, the girl watched it all unfold, unmoved, calculating, and entirely in control. Violence, the mistress believed, would restore order. She struck where she thought disobedience lay. She raged where she thought suspicion gathered. But each act only revealed more weaknesses, more patterns, more predictable responses. And the girl, patient and unseen, began to orchestrate these eruptions, nudging them subtly, ensuring that chaos unfolded precisely according to her design. Fear became a mirror, bouncing back onto the one who wielded it most aggressively. Here is a truth few dare to admit. The most dangerous power is invisible. Those who act openly, with anger, with violence, with obsession, are often the easiest to predict, the easiest to manipulate. The girl had learned this in the suffocating shadows of her attic. Every flinch, every hesitation, every misplaced blow from the mistress became a ripple she could exploit, extending her influence deeper into the household, reshaping alliances and bending obedience to her will. Objects in the attic, the diaries, the carved symbols, the hidden letters, now became instruments of precision. A fragment revealed at the right moment, a hint of knowledge whispered to a servant, a subtle gesture that only a few noticed. All served to amplify the mistress's self-doubt, redirect her fury, and consolidate the girl's invisible control. The violence below was now choreographed, a dance orchestrated from above, yet perceived as chaos by those trapped inside it. And now, as you listen, understand this. Those who strike in anger, who seek dominance through fear, rarely recognize the forces shaping their actions. Control can be inverted without a single confrontation, without a raised voice. Observation, patience, and knowledge are weapons far sharper than any lash or shout. The girl had become the master of these currents, and the mistress, once absolute, was now a puppet in a game she could no longer see, her obsession and violence merely threads woven into a tapestry she did not realize she was helping the girl construct. It happened on a night thick with tension, when the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The mistress stormed through the halls, furious and unpredictable, her footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of impending punishment. Yet, in the attic, the girl moved quietly, deliberately, arranging the smallest details with precision. A chair slightly shifted, a lantern angled to cast a shadow, a door left ajar at the exact moment of confrontation, every imperfection magnified, every reaction predictable. And then it occurred. The mistress entered the main hall, prepared for rebellion, expecting resistance. But what greeted her was perfectly orchestrated obedience, though it was not obedience in the way she knew. The servants, subtly guided by invisible cues from above, executed every task flawlessly, yet carried an undercurrent of tension, a shadow of fear that did not belong to her. And in that moment, the mistress realized, too late, that control had silently slipped from her grasp. Here is a truth rarely acknowledged. Dominance is not always seized by confrontation. It is often claimed by those who understand systems, patterns, and the subtleties others overlook. The girl had created a network of influence so precise, so invisible, that the mistress could not detect it until it had already reshaped the dynamics of power. And in that instant, the household recognized the unspoken truth. The attic, the shadows, and the silent presence above were no longer insignificant. They were the true architects of obedience and fear. The mistress's eyes widened as she perceived the subtle shifts, the minute gestures, the orchestrated compliance that had seemed spontaneous. Every act she had relied upon to maintain dominance had been anticipated, inverted, or neutralized. The girl had turned the tools of fear, the lessons of cruelty, and the secrets of the house into instruments of her own authority. And the house itself seemed to bow to her influence, trembling under a power no one below could name. And now, as you listen, understand this. Control is often invisible until it is undeniable. A shadow can wield more influence than a scream. Observation, patience, and strategic placement of knowledge can bend reality without confrontation. The girl had become the unseen force, the architect of subtle dominance, and the mistress, once a figure of absolute power, was now fully exposed as a player in a game she could not even comprehend. The attic was no longer merely a place of observation, it had become a launch pad for influence. The girl's reach extended beyond the house, touching corners of the estate, the servants' networks, even whispers carried to neighboring properties. A message misdelivered, a rumor subtly spread, a hesitation encouraged at the right moment. All of it was guided by her unseen hand. She had become more than a shadow within walls. She was the unseen architect of a system she had not yet left. The mistress, consumed by her obsession, could not fathom the breadth of control the girl now wielded. Each attempt to discipline or assert dominance was countered not just within the household, but in ways she could not observe. A servant's hesitation here, a neighbor's curiosity there, all orchestrated subtly, almost invisibly, to maintain the girl's advantage, and every failure the mistress experienced reinforced the girl's growing mastery. Here is a truth the world rarely acknowledges. Power does not need permission to expand. It grows quietly, invisibly, exploiting weaknesses in systems, in people, in routines. Observation alone is not enough. It must be combined with patience, foresight, and subtle intervention. The girl had become a master of these principles. Each ripple she created outside the house fed back into the inner world, bending obedience, fear, and loyalty in directions no one below could predict. Objects, symbols, and secrets from the attic became instruments of leverage beyond the household. A misread letter here, a slight delay there, a carefully timed revelation. Each act manipulated perception, fear, and expectation. And as the mistress flailed, trying to maintain control, she unknowingly reinforced the girl's network of influence, giving power to the very force she sought to suppress. And now, as you listen, understand this. Influence is rarely confined to the immediate. Systems, relationships, even entire networks can be shaped by subtle, invisible forces. Those who underestimate the quiet strategist, the observer, the patient manipulator are doomed to be swept aside. The girl, hidden in the attic, had already begun to bend the broader world to her design, a force no one below could measure, a presence both unseen and unstoppable. The mistress had become a ghost of her former self. Once proud, unyielding, and feared, she now moved like a shadow, haunted by her own obsession, her authority crumbling beneath the weight of unseen manipulation. Every decision was plagued by doubt. Every glance at her servants, her family, her surroundings carried hesitation. And all the while, the girl watched from her attic sanctuary, cataloguing every fracture, every tremor, every sign of the mistress's unraveling mind. The estate itself seemed to bend under this silent power. Hallways that had once echoed authority now whispered doubt. Rooms that had held terror now carried the tension of invisible control. Every servant, every child, every neighbor, even the mistress's closest allies, unaware, unwilling, or unable to resist, began to operate within the currents the girl had created. Her influence had seeped into every corner, every interaction, every heartbeat of the household. Here is a truth almost no one will admit. The most complete domination is not enforced, it is orchestrated. It thrives in observation, patience, and the strategic placement of knowledge and subtle influence. The girl had learned this fully. She no longer needed to act openly. She only needed to guide, to hint, to let fear, suspicion, and obedience align themselves according to her design. And in that alignment, she became absolute. Objects in the attic, hidden symbols, forgotten letters, and secrets that once terrified the mistress now acted as instruments of leverage, amplifying her influence in ways the mistress could never perceive. Every attempt by the mistress to regain control played into the girl's hands, deepening the cracks in her psyche, making the invisible power above undeniable. And in those cracks the girl planted the seeds of final mastery. And now, as you listen, remember this. Dominance is often imperceptible until its is undeniable. Those who act loudly, violently, or with obsession are predictable. The unseen strategist, the patient manipulator, the one who understands systems, fear, and obedience, wields the true power. The girl had become that force. The mistress, consumed by paranoia, obsession, and fading authority, could no longer influence a world already reshaped by someone she believed powerless. The attic had become a throne, and the girl its sovereign. The girl no longer needed whispers or subtle nudges. Her control had become symbolic, etched into the very rhythm of the household. A single gesture, a carefully placed object, a barely perceptible glance. Each now carried meaning, authority, and the undeniable weight of dominance. Servants hesitated before speaking. Children glanced nervously when her shadow passed, and even the mistress flinched at the faintest indication of her presence. The house itself recognized the new order. Every corner, every hallway, every room was a stage for her silent authority. The attic, once a hiding place, had become a command center, its shadows stretching outward into every interaction below. Objects once forgotten, books, letters, carved symbols, were now instruments of obedience, subtle markers that shaped behavior without overt confrontation. And the household, trapped within these invisible currents, moved as though by instinct, unaware of the architect guiding them. Here is a truth few acknowledge. Power is most absolute when it cannot be challenged, when it shapes thought, action, and perception without visibility. The girl had become that force. Fear and respect were no longer earned, they were assumed. Every heartbeat, every hesitation, every suppressed glance in the household bore her influence. She had woven herself into the very fabric of the estate, a silent sovereign who needed no throne, no declaration, no audience. Even the mistress, once towering in authority, now existed only as a reminder of what had been lost. Every attempt at dominance or control only reinforced the girl's position, leaving the mistress trapped in a spiral of paranoia and helplessness. Her cruelty, once feared, was now a tool the girl wielded, redirecting it to magnify obedience, distrust, and tension across the estate. And now, as you listen, understand this. Influence is rarely earned through force. True power is symbolic, subtle, and omnipresent. It manifests in hesitation, obedience, and fear that no one dares question. The girl had become that power, unseen yet undeniable, bending the wills of those around her, embedding her authority in every shadow and object, in every glance and gesture. And as you watch, reflect. How many systems around you are shaped by forces just as invisible, just as absolute as the girl in that attic? The night arrived when subtlety was no longer enough. The attic had accumulated its treasures, forgotten diaries, carved symbols, objects of obsession, letters revealing hidden betrayals. The girl surveyed them like a general preparing for battle. Every fragment of knowledge, every shadowed corner, every secret the mistress had hoarded now belonged to her. And she understood, with absolute clarity, that revelation was the final instrument of control. The household, already trembling under invisible currents, would now witness the full extent of her power. She descended carefully from the attic, carrying more than presence. She carried the weight of truth, fear, and manipulation perfected. The mistress, sensing some impending change, tensed, her paranoia amplified by decades of obsession. She could feel the shift, but could not name its source, and that precisely was the point. Here is a truth most refuse to face. Domination is complete only when the controlled recognize consciously or unconsciously the power guiding them. The girl had learned to cultivate fear, obedience, and awe without direct confrontation. But now, armed with the attic's darkest secrets, she would force recognition. Each object revealed, each whispered truth, each subtle display of knowledge would unmask the mistress's vulnerability and consolidate her invisible authority into undeniable mastery. As the night unfolded, servants faltered, children hesitated, and the mistress recoiled at truths she had buried and believed safe. Objects that had seemed harmless, a diary, a carved symbol, a faded letter, became instruments of psychological dominance, each one a reflection of the mistress's failures and the girl's triumph. The house itself seemed to acknowledge the new order, shadows stretching like silent witnesses to her absolute authority. And now, as you listen, understand this. Power is perfecti, in the unmasking of secrets. Control is cemented when those around you realize, subtly, irrevocably, that the architect of influence is unseen yet omnipresent. The girl had transformed the attic from a hiding place into a throne of omnipotence, and every secret it contained had been converted into leverage that no one below could resist. This was no longer subtlety, this was mastery in its purest, darkest form, and it left everyone who witnessed it speechless, powerless, and forever altered. The mistress's collapse was complete. Every word she spoke, every command she issued, rang hollow. The servants no longer flinched at her voice. The children no longer trembled at her presence. Even her closest allies, trained for obedience, hesitated, instinctively gauging the invisible currents that had shifted beyond her control. And at the center of it all, perched above in the attic, the girl remained untouched, patient, and absolute. The house had become a theater of silent recognition. Every glance, every subtle movement, every whispered conversation carried acknowledgement of her authority. It was no longer about fear alone. It was about understanding the pattern, the power, the invisible hand that guided every action. The girl had transformed observation into dominance, silence into influence, and hidden knowledge into an instrument of unquestioned control. Here is a truth few ever admit. Authority is real only when acknowledged, consciously or unconsciously, by those around you. The girl had achieved it without a single confrontation, without a display of force. She had taken the mistress's own obsession, her tools of fear and punishment, and turned them into instruments that reinforced her unseen sovereignty. Every attempt at defiance, every gesture of power, only served to highlight her dominance. The mistress, once a figure of terror, now appeared as a shadow of herself, reactive, fragmented, incapable of enforcing her will. Her paranoia, her obsession, her every act of cruelty had been inverted, redirected, absorbed into the currents of influence that the girl had orchestrated. The household's obedience was no longer to the mistress, but to the pattern, the unseen strategist who had rewritten the rules from above. And now, as you listen, remember this. Influence is most absolute when it is invisible yet undeniable. Mastery is not always a confrontation. Yet it is a quiet, patient, strategic orchestration of systems, people, and fear. The girl had become that force. The house, the estate, and the people within it now obeyed her, not because they had no choice, but because the invisible currents of power had made recognition inevitable. The attic, once a prison, had become the epicenter of dominance, and from that perch, she ruled absolutely, silently, and irrevocably. The girl chose her final act not with violence, not with threats, but with symbolism, subtle, undeniable, and unforgettable. A single object, carefully placed in the center of the main hall, became the focal point of the household's awareness. A diary left open, revealing secrets the mistress had desperately tried to bury. A carved symbol, positioned to cast shadows across every corner. A candle flickering over a letter that spoke of betrayal, obedience, and hidden truths. Each element was meticulously arranged, an invisible signature of dominance. As the household gathered, they felt it instinctively, an unease, a tension, a recognition of authority they could not articulate. The mistress tried to speak, to command, to reclaim her fractured power, but her voice faltered. Her gestures, once fearsome, were now meaningless. Every attempt to assert control collided with the invisible architecture the girl had constructed. The objects, the shadows, the whispers, the timing, they all converged to leave a single, undeniable impression. Power had shifted, and it was no longer held by the one they had always feared. Here is a truth few ever acknowledge. True mastery is felt, not always seen. Influence is a current, subtle and unstoppable, shaping thought, perception, and behavior without overt action. The girl had engineered such a current, embedding her authority into the very psyche of the household. Every glance at the diary, every shadow cast by the symbol, every whispered realization cemented her dominance in ways the mistress could neither anticipate nor reverse. The mistress's collapse became complete, psychological and absolute. Servants who had once obeyed only out of fear now acted in alignment with the invisible patterns she had set. Children who had once flinched at cruelty now moved within the currents of her design, and the girl from her attic perch watched a culmination of decades of observation, patience, and strategic influence manifest in the tangible acknowledgement of authority. And now, as you listen, understand this. The most profound power is silent, subtle, and symbolic. It imprints itself on the mind, bends perception, and shapes behavior in ways that direct force cannot. The girl had transformed the attic, the shadows, and the hidden knowledge into instruments of irreversible dominance. She had rewritten the rules, redefined fear, and left a legacy that would echo in the household long after her presence became visible. And now, every person within those walls would remember, forever, the invisible hand that guided them, the master they could never confront, and the lessons whispered in the shadows they would never forget. The final victory was not in a confrontation, it was in permanence. The girl understood that dominance is only meaningful when it endures, when the patterns of fear, obedience, and recognition are embedded so deeply that no single act can unravel them. From her attic, she began to enforce invisible rules, subtle rituals, and daily reminders of authority that ensured the household would continue to bend to her influence long after her physical presence was acknowledged. Each morning, objects were left in precise positions, letters subtly highlighted, shadows falling across rooms in patterns that reinforced her control. Every glance from her perch was a reminder of her unseen influence. Servants, children, even the fractured mistress acted within these currents, internalizing obedience and fear as natural, inevitable parts of daily life. They no longer needed to be reminded, they had been trained by invisible architecture into compliance. Here is a truth few ever confront. Power that endures is psychological first, physical second. Fear, respect, and authority must be felt, internalized, and recognized as undeniable, whether or not the source is visible. The girl had accomplished this masterfully. She had transformed an attic into a citadel, shadows into instruments, and secrets into unbreakable levers of influence. Every household member became a participant in their own subjugation, unaware of how completely they had been integrated into the system she had created. The mistress, now completely broken, existed only as a reminder of failed domination. Her attempts to reclaim power were internalized as weakness, her presence reinforcing the girl's invisible authority instead of diminishing it. The estate, the house, and even the surrounding grounds were now governed by patterns the girl had designed, invisible yet absolute, flowing through every human and object like an unbroken current. And now, as you listen, understand this. The greatest power is unseen yet undeniable. True mastery is not a display of force. It is the quiet, patient shaping of systems, perception, and behavior, until obedience and recognition exist as instinct. The girl had done more than control a household. She had rewritten the rules of influence, embedding her authority in every shadow, every glance, every heartbeat. And anyone who understood her methods would see the same principles at play in the systems surrounding them, waiting for mastery to be claimed by those patient enough to understand it. And so it ended, not with a shout, not with violence, not with a declaration, but with quiet inevitability. The girl had transformed an attic into a throne, shadows into instruments, and secrets into unbreakable levers of dominance. The mistress, broken and fractured, remained as a symbol of failed authority. her power consumed by the currents she could not perceive. The household moved with silent obedience, patterns of fear and recognition embedded so deeply that they no longer questioned them. They had internalized a system they could neither see nor escape. Here is the final truth few dare to confront. Mastery that endures is invisible. Authority that shapes perception, fear, and behavior will persist far longer than any act of violence or command. The girl had become that mastery. She had converted observation into dominance, patience into strategy, and forbidden knowledge into absolute influence. The attic, the shadows, the objects, and the secrets, they were not merely tools. They were extensions of her will, permanently reshaping everyone who had once believed themselves in control. Even the mistress, once a figure of terror, became a living lesson. Her obsession, her cruelty, her failed attempts at dominance, they all reinforced the girl's unseen power. Servants, children, allies, all now functioned within the invisible architecture she had constructed. Every glance, every gesture, every heartbeat of the household carried acknowledgement of authority that was never declared but universally understood. The girl had achieved not just control, but a permanent psychological legacy. And now, as you listen, reflect on this. Influence, patience, and the quiet use of knowledge can reshape entire systems. The most dangerous power is often the one you cannot see, the one that silently bends thought, perception, and behavior until recognition is inevitable. The girl had become that force. The house, the estate, the people within it, forever marked by her invisible hand, would carry her influence long after the shadow shifted, long after the attic no longer held her presence, long after anyone thought they were free. This is the legacy of fear, perfected, hidden, and absolute. And if you understand it, truly understand it, you will begin to see the same currents in the world around you. Currents shaped by invisible hands, orchestrated by those who understand patience, observation, and the strategic deployment of knowledge. The girl's mastery was not just her own. It is a lesson, a warning, and a revelation for anyone daring enough to recognize the unseen forces that govern obedience, fear, and authority.